The wind carried the smell of dust and horseshoe iron, and when Agnes stepped down from the stagecoach, she did so with her chin up and a ribbon tied around her waist, a ribbon that matched the one she'd sent in the photograph months ago. Her boots hit the dry soil of Crestwood, Wyoming, as though they expected to be welcomed. She waited, brushing off her skirt, eyes scanning the faces, ranchers lounging by the saloon, women hanging laundry and sunbonnets, the sheriff squinting beneath his hat brim. But no one stepped forward. She stood with her hands folded like a prayer in front of her, clutching a letter creased and stained by nervous fingers. The paper still bore the name Thomas R. Halpern, the man who had written with such confidence, who had signed "Yours soon, God willing." The man who had promised her a wedding in the spring, a cabin near the Red Cliffs, and a horse of her own once they had settled in. Instead, she saw him across the square. He glanced once, and turned his face as if the sun had blinded him. Then he walked off, hat lowered, never breaking stride. The shame didn't come like thunder. It came quiet, like the way fire eats through a dress hem, slow and hot and too fast to stop once it begins. She tried the boarding house next. The woman who answered, Mrs. Dorcas Albee, peered over her glasses like she was inspecting something gone sour. "You're the one who wrote about a wedding," she said. "Well, it don't look like there's a wedding." Agnes held out a small cloth purse of coin, but Dorcas didn't even look. "You can't stay here. Folks are particular. And they already whisper more than I like." The town watched her. Not with interest, but with amusement. Girls in aprons giggled behind windows. Boys tossed stones near her boots. The sheriff tipped his hat but said nothing. The preacher, Harlan Cobb, offered to pray with her but said he couldn't offer a room. So Agnes walked past the edge of town, past the last fence post, and into a grove where the pines leaned over a forgotten barn. It was half collapsed, one beam bowed like a man in mourning. But it had a roof. And hay. And silence. She climbed into the loft, curled herself around the warmest pile of straw she could find, and let the tears come in the dark where no one could see. That night, she dreamed of music. Not a song she could name, but the shape of one. A melody that drifted in the warm air of Tennessee summers, where her mother's voice once hummed by the garden, and where she'd once believed in being chosen. The second night, her fingers grew stiff. The wind rattled through the gaps in the wood, and the ground outside turned white with the first kiss of frost. Her stomach growled. She had eaten only half a biscuit in 2 days. The letter from Thomas remained folded in her pocket, unread and unreadable. On the third morning, she woke to the sound of hooves. A horse stood outside the barn, breath puffing in the cold air. Atop it sat a man dressed in buckskin, a long braid down his shoulder, dark eyes set beneath a fur-lined hood. He didn't speak. Didn't approach. Just waited, as if listening for something only he could hear. Agnes didn't move. She barely breathed. Then he turned and rode off. She watched him disappear into the trees. There was no cruelty in his presence. Just a stillness. A waiting. The sun rose higher. Her stomach burned. Her hands trembled as she reached for the last crumb of her biscuit. And then, just as she sank back into the hay, the door creaked. She startled. He stood there now on foot, horse tied loosely to a branch. He was tall, maybe 30, with skin like worn leather and a quietness about him that unsettled her more than any shout would have. In his hand, a folded cloth. He set it on a beam. A bundle, bread, a tin cup, and a flask of water. She didn't speak. Neither did he. Only after a long pause did he say, voice low and nearly tender, "You can come on out now. Ain't nobody watching." Agnes stayed where she was. The straw clung to her dress, her hair. Her pride. He didn't ask questions. Didn't look at her the way the townsfolk did. Just stepped outside and waited. She heard the horse shift its weight. The wind carried the scent of pine smoke and something floral, lavender, maybe, from whatever the cloth had once been used for. She crept down the ladder an hour later, barefoot, holding the bundle like it might vanish if she blinked. The bread was coarse and plain, but it tasted like home. She ate it slowly, each bite a kind of defiance against the ache in her belly. She didn't cry. That evening, she found a wool blanket folded near the barn's side door. And beside it, a pair of gloves. No note. No name. She didn't see him again that night, but she knew he had watched the stars, just like her. On the fourth day, she bathed in the creek with shaking hands, behind rocks slick with frost. She scrubbed until her skin turned pink and raw, then wrapped herself in the blanket and returned to the barn. There he was again. This time seated on a log, sharpening a blade. He nodded once, not intruding. She sat on the threshold, a safe distance between them, and held out the gloves. "You left these," she said. His voice was quiet. "They ain't mine anymore." He told her his name was John. He told her nothing else. She told him hers was Agnes, though she doubted he hadn't already known. She asked where he was from. He answered with a shrug. "I've been here longer than the town's fences." That night, she didn't climb the ladder. She lay on the lower level of the barn, closer to the door, to the warmth of the fire he'd lit in the metal drum just outside. And when she closed her eyes, she felt something unexpected, not safety, not exactly. But a truce with the cold. By the end of the week, town whispers swelled like a coming storm. She heard them from the pastor's boy, who brought bread once. "They say you're living like a stray," he muttered, eyes down. "Say he's keeping you like a secret." She wanted to shout at him. But the shame choked her before the anger could. Still, when the boy left, she stayed. She stayed, even as the barn moaned under winter's weight and the wind bit through the boards like hunger through flesh. She stayed, because sometimes the only kindness left in a place was the kind that didn't speak, only offered a blanket, and waited. The town had left her behind. But someone else had said, "Come on out." And somehow, that voice lingered louder than all the others. Even now. The frost deepened overnight, crawling up the barn's beams like pale ivy. Agnes awoke with a sharp intake of breath as her joints ached from cold and a night spent curled too tightly. Her dress still held the scent of old hay, but there was warmth in the wool blanket draped around her shoulders, left there again, silently, by the man she barely knew. John. She hadn't spoken to anyone in Crestwood in days. Not since the sheriff averted his gaze and the preacher offered her prayers instead of shelter. But the Apache widower kept returning, never with questions, never with judgment. Each visit brought something quiet and useful. A loaf of bread wrapped in linen. A half bucket of goat's milk. Dried meat in a small tin. A silence so full it softened the hard edges of being forgotten. He didn't stand too close. Never crossed the boundary between caution and comfort. He simply appeared, leaning against his horse, sometimes whittling, sometimes staring at the sky. Agnes watched him through the barn slats, wondering how someone could feel both stranger and safe all at once. One morning, as snowflakes began to drift lazily across the fields, she stepped outside holding the tin. "I can wash this," she said, her voice rasped from days of disuse. John looked up, surprised only slightly. "Ain't no need." She stood her ground anyway. "I want to." He nodded, and the briefest trace of a smile flickered in the corner of his mouth. By the stream, she knelt in silence and scrubbed the tin clean, her reflection rippling over the icy water. Behind her, the pine forest whispered softly in the wind. She felt his gaze from afar, not intrusive, just steady. When she handed it back to him, he said only, "Thank you." Not a question. Not an invitation. Just 2 words, and that was enough. Over the next few days, they began to share small things. She spoke of Tennessee only in slivers, how the porch back home had roses that curled around the posts like reaching fingers, how her mother once sang old hymns while sewing, how her father's eyes were tired before she ever knew what exhaustion looked like. John listened without commentary, but with a focus that made her feel seen. He never filled silences unnecessarily. Instead, he worked, splitting wood, mending a broken saddle, tying bundles of herbs with strips of sinew. His hands were calloused but careful. His presence never rushed. One afternoon, he left a small book beside the barn door, bound in leather, the corners worn, the name Anita pressed into the inside cover. Agnes traced the letters with her thumb. "Your wife?" she asked when he returned the next day. He nodded. She passed. In the winter. Childbirth. She didn't press further. Loss doesn't need to be unwrapped to be understood. Later that evening, she sat on the barn threshold while he sat on a stump nearby. The snow fell slowly, like it didn't want to interrupt. "I was supposed to marry a man named Halpern," she said. "He saw me, and left. Didn't even say my name." John didn't respond right away. Then, without turning, he said, "Names only mean what people make of them. Maybe yours ain't finished yet." The next morning, she found her boots neatly placed by the barn door, the mud cleaned off, the laces tightened. A small carving sat beside them, an elk, no larger than her thumb. She stared at it for a long time, wondering why the kindness hurt worse than the cruelty had. The town had not forgotten her. If anything, it remembered too loudly. 2 boys from the saloon tossed a stone toward the barn and called her a name that cracked through the trees like a whip. She didn't flinch, just pulled the blanket tighter and kept sweeping the dirt floor. Later, Pastor Cobb stopped by the barn on his way to visit a sick elder. His eyes were kind, but nervous. "I only mean to say," he murmured, shifting on his boots, "that appearances, they matter. Especially for a woman on her own." She didn't answer. Just looked past him, to where John's horse had stood earlier. "I'm not on my own," she said finally, not with defiance, but with a kind of tired grace. That evening, John brought wild honey in a clay jar. She lit a candle inside the barn, the flame dancing on the timber walls, and poured the honey over old cornbread he'd left earlier. They ate on opposite sides of the open doorway, with only the snowfall between them. She handed him the book, Anita's book, and asked, "Would you like me to read from it?" He nodded. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied. The story was simple: a woman planting seeds, losing them to frost, planting again. Hope tucked in soil, again and again. When she looked up, John's eyes were closed. Not asleep. Listening. Something changed in her that night. Not all at once, not loudly. Just a shift in weight, like a coat hung up after days of wear. The next morning, she caught sight of herself in the old mirror nailed crooked above a trough. Her face had softened. The sharp line between her brows had eased. She took the brush and combed her hair for the first time in a week. That same afternoon, she walked into town. She didn't plan to. Her feet just started down the path, past the fence posts, toward the store. The people stared. The murmurs began before she reached the general store steps. Mrs. Albee saw her and sniffed like catching a whiff of rot. Agnes kept walking. Inside, she bought only salt and matches. Set the coins down and said thank you with a straight spine. As she turned, a woman nearby muttered, "You'd think shame had a limit." Agnes paused at the door. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Outside, John waited by the hitching post. He hadn't gone in. He never did. When she stepped beside him, he handed her a bundle of dried sage. "For the cold," he said. She took it and smiled, the kind that comes not from happiness but from surviving another day with grace. They walked back together, side by side, through the falling snow. By the time they reached the barn, Agnes was humming a tune she hadn't remembered in years. The melody danced in the still air, just above the sound of the trees. And in the quiet that followed, John looked at her, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as someone who had stayed. Someone who hadn't run. And who, perhaps, wasn't planning to. The days grew short and quiet, like a breath held just before snow. Agnes no longer flinched when the wind howled through the trees. She had learned which boards creaked in the barn, which knots in the pine floor snagged her skirt, which slant of morning light meant it was time to fetch water. And John, he came like the seasons now. Not every hour, not every day, but always when needed. A man of few words, fewer expectations. His presence was not loud. It settled, like a blanket across tired shoulders. Some mornings, they sat on opposite ends of the barn step. A tin cup of tea between them, steam twisting upward into the crisp air. They didn't talk much. And that was all right. Agnes found she didn't need the comfort of conversation anymore, only the knowledge that someone else existed who didn't ask her to explain herself. He brought her things without saying so. A string of dried apples. A stitched pair of wool socks. One day, a wooden comb carved smooth as river stones. She found it tucked into the crook of the beam where she hung her shawl. No note. No mention. She brushed her hair with it that night, her curls loosening, her breath easing with each slow pull. In return, she swept the path to his cabin when the snow began to stick. Not far, just a clearing up the hill. She carried buckets of water, folded his laundry on the flat stone near the creek, trimmed the herbs he left hanging from the rafters. She never said she would. He never asked. On the fourth Sunday, he taught her how to tie a rabbit snare. "You have to listen for where they go," he murmured, kneeling in the snow, his fingers moving gently. They returned to the same places. Like people. She didn't reply, only watched his hands. She could see the veins, the tiny scars. This was a man who had survived the kind of work that didn't leave a mark on the outside, but carved its cost into the bones. That night, they shared a rabbit stew in silence. She chewed slowly. He nodded after tasting it, once, satisfied. Then passed her the salt without being asked. Later, under the stars, he built a fire behind the barn. She brought the wool blanket. They sat wrapped in their own thoughts, her arm brushing his only once when she shifted. He didn't pull away. "I used to be afraid of silence," she whispered, eyes locked on the flames. At home, it meant anger. Or grief. Or something worse. But here, it's softer. John stirred the fire with a stick. Silence can hold things words drop. The town, meanwhile, grew sharper in its cruelty. Whispers turned to warnings. Someone nailed a scrap of paper near the saloon post, "God don't bless whores and savages." Agnes found it the next morning, blowing in the wind. She folded it carefully and burned it without a word. Pastor Cobb stopped her on the road a few days later. "Miss Whitfield, the town council's talkin'. Some say your presence is an offense." She stared at him. He added, softer, "They'll never say it outright, but they want you gone. And they think he should be too." Agnes's hands tightened on the loaf she carried. "Then they'll just have to keep wanting." That night, she sat with John beside the fire again. This time, she reached over and took his hand. Not boldly. Not with heat. Just enough to say, "I'm still here." He didn't move for a long moment. Then, softly, his fingers curled around hers. That gesture, that silence, that shared breath, it built more than 1,000 words ever could. Another week passed. Snow piled high on the barn's roof. She took to writing her name in the frost on the windows with her fingertip. Once, she added a tiny heart beside it, then quickly wiped it away before anyone could see. She found John watching her once from the path, arms crossed, amused. "Do you miss home?" he asked gently. "I'm not sure I ever had one," she said. "But I think I know what one might feel like now." She tried to cook him cornbread one evening. It burned on the edges and fell apart when she cut it. He ate every crumb without flinching. "I'll try again tomorrow," she said, cheeks pink. He only nodded, eyes kind. The next morning, he left a note carved into the snow by the barn steps with the toe of his boot, "Better than any I've had." She smiled for the first time in weeks, a real one that lived in the eyes. That afternoon, she took down the old dress she'd packed all the way from Tennessee. The one she'd worn when she stepped off the coach. She brushed it out, pinned the hem, mended the sleeve with a quiet determination. It wasn't about the man who had left her. It was about her. About standing up straight again. The next time she saw John, she wore it. No makeup. No ribbons. Just that soft, ivory cotton and bare feet in the snow. He paused as he saw her, something quiet and stunned flickering behind his eyes. She expected him to say nothing. "Instead," he said, "that dress don't look like it's waitin' on anyone anymore." It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd heard in years. Later that day, they sat by the fire again, the dress folded neatly beside her. She told him a story about her mother's hands, how she used to trace the wrinkles and say each one held a secret memory. John listened with the kind of attention most people reserve for sacred scripture. The barn creaked under the weight of another snowfall. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled once and went silent. Inside, the lantern flickered low. She moved closer to the warmth. His shoulder was against hers now, neither retreating. The storm outside would last the night, maybe two. But Agnes no longer felt like something waiting to be rescued. She had made her place. One teacup, one fire, one silent glance at a time. And though the town might still whisper her name like a curse, in this place, by this fire, beside this man, her name was hers again. That was enough for now. And more than enough to stay. The first true snow came down like a hush over the land, erasing every footprint Agnes had ever made. By morning, the barn roof wore a thick white blanket and the trees bent low with weight, as if bowing under memory. She stood at the edge of the barn door, arms wrapped around herself, watching flakes drift past like ashes from a gentler fire. Inside, the fire crackled low. John had brought her a clay pot of stew before sunrise, leaving it beside the door without a word. She'd seen his silhouette vanishing between the trees, his shoulders hunched against the cold, the fur collar of his coat dusted with frost. She'd grown used to him arriving without noise and leaving without promise. Yet each return felt like a vow unspoken, but steady. That morning, she stirred the stew slowly, savoring the warmth. The flavor held pine smoke, wild onion, and something that felt like history. She ate in silence, then folded the cloth he'd wrapped around it and placed it near the fire to dry. Later that day, she ventured toward his cabin. The snow came to her knees. Each step was slow, her breath visible with every exhale. The wind stung her cheeks, but she didn't turn back. When she arrived, he was outside splitting wood, shirt sleeves rolled despite the cold. He looked up and nodded as if he'd been expecting her. She held out the folded cloth. "Thank you." He took it gently, then gestured toward a bench beneath the awning. She sat. He offered her a tin cup of spruce tea, its steam curling upward between them. The world around them was white and wide. The only color, her red scarf and his dark eyes, always watching without pressure. After a long pause, he said, "Storm's not done. Another night like this, maybe two." Agnes nodded. "Barn roof's holding. For now." He set down his cup. "Come to the cabin." It wasn't a question. Nor was it a command. Just an offering, like the stew, like the gloves, like his presence. She didn't answer right away. The idea felt larger than just shelter. It felt like stepping out of exile, like standing where the whole town could see and would see. She looked down at her boots. People will talk. They already do. The simplicity of it struck her. "I don't want to be pitted," she whispered. "You won't be," he said. "Not by me." So she nodded, and they packed what little she had. A shawl, her mother's Bible, the sewing needle she'd found under the barn's beam. He carried it all without comment, and by dusk they stood at the cabin's threshold. Inside, it smelled of cedar and smoke. The bed was simple, built by hand. The walls were lined with herbs, drying in neat rows. A small rug lay at the center of the floor, faded reds and ochres, once vibrant. He placed her bag by the hearth, then poured her another cup of tea. They didn't speak much that evening. She sat by the fire, stitching a loose hem. He whittled something small in his hands, the shavings curling like snow on the floorboards. Later, as the wind howled outside, she asked, "Did you build this place for her?" He looked into the fire. "For her, and for the child." Agnes nodded slowly. The silence after that was heavier, but not uncomfortable. Like standing in the shadow of something sacred. That night, she took the bed, though she offered to sleep on the floor. He shook his head. "I'll take the bench." "I can't let you do that." He smiled, faintly. "You're not letting me. I'm choosing." She didn't argue. Just pulled the quilt over her shoulders and stared at the ceiling as the snow whispered against the windows. The days blurred. She began sweeping the floor, tending the herbs, heating water for tea. He showed her how to check the traps, how to track prints in the snow. When they walked through the trees together, he always kept her to the inside of the path, his body between her and the wind. Sometimes they spoke of small things, how long winters lasted here, what birds stayed behind, what dreams she had as a girl. She confessed she once wanted to be a schoolteacher, though she'd never said it aloud. He didn't laugh. "You'd be good at it. You watch. You don't push." One night, she found an old journal tucked behind a beam. Inside were drawings, ink and charcoal, delicate and precise. Flowers. Animals. A woman's hands, folded in her lap. She ran her fingers over the page, then brought it to the firelight. "Yours?" He nodded. "Anita used to say drawing made me more patient." "Did she model for these?" He looked at the page. "Only the hands." Agnes closed the book gently. She had a lovely stillness. She did. They didn't speak of it again, but she placed the book back with care, spine outward. On the 7th night, the storm quieted. They stood at the threshold again, watching the sky begin to clear. The stars blinked like frost caught mid-fall. "Do you think this ends?" she asked softly. "The way people look at us?" He didn't look away from the sky. "It might not. But we get to decide what it means." She exhaled, her breath a ribbon of cloud. "I used to think I was only worth what someone chose in me," she said. "But now I think I might choose myself." He turned to her then. Not close, not touching. Just meeting her eyes in that frozen hush. "You already have." The wind stirred the pines behind them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried out and fell silent. Inside, the fire waited. The quilt lay folded at the edge of the bench. Her cup sat beside his on the table. Agnes stepped back into the warmth, her fingers tingling as they thawed. She didn't glance back, not because she feared judgment, but because it no longer held her captive. She was not what they called her. She was not the woman left behind. She was a woman who had endured 3 nights beneath hay, and then stayed to learn the quiet language of presence. The snow had not come to bury her. It had come to wash the road clean. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, in the way the icicles stopped weeping during the night and the wind shifted from slicing to sighing. One morning, Agnes stepped outside and noticed green returning to the world. Small shoots near the path. Pine needles uncurling. A bird bold enough to sing again. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood still in that sliver of warmth, the rising sun brushing her cheek. Behind her, smoke curled gently from the cabin chimney. Inside, John lay asleep, his breath slow, shallow, steady again. He had fallen ill 3 weeks before. A fever that came on like fire, stealing his strength and blurring his eyes. She had sat beside him every hour. Feeding him broth. Cooling his brow with cloth soaked in creek water. Praying quietly, not in words, but in desperate acts of care. She'd crushed herbs with trembling hands. Whispered his name when he drifted too far into sleep. When he shivered, she wrapped herself around him, skin to skin, giving what little heat she had. And he'd lived. Now, as the world turned green again, so did she. Inside, he stirred. His voice, when it came, was quiet but certain. "You should walk into town today." Agnes turned to the doorway. "Why?" He propped himself on one elbow. "Because they need to see what you've become." She hesitated. "They won't understand." "Don't need to." She folded her arms, looking away. "It's not just them. I don't know what I'd say. Or how I'd look." "You've never looked more like yourself," he said. The words rooted deep, deeper than flattery ever could. She bathed, braided her hair, and put on the same ivory dress she had worn the day she arrived in Crestwood. But now it fit differently. Not looser. Not tighter. Just truer. As if it had finally found its wearer. John handed her a necklace before she left. A silver chain, simple and worn, with a turquoise stone at its heart. This was hers, he said, pressing it into her palm. I think she'd want you to wear it. Agnes's eyes filled, but she didn't weep. She fastened it around her neck and whispered, "Thank you for trusting me with her memory." She rode into town on a borrowed mare, the wind soft in her ears. No one expected her. The first person to see her was Pastor Cobb. He stood frozen in the church doorway, as if seeing a ghost that smiled back. Mrs. Albee glanced up from her porch, needlework falling still in her lap. Her mouth tightened, but her eyes flickered, not with victory, but recognition. Agnes walked to the general store. Bought flour, salt, 2 spools of thread. Paid in coin and calm. When she turned to leave, she heard an older woman, seated near the stove, murmuring just loud enough, "Guess she ain't gone after all." Agnes didn't stop. But this time, she did reply. "I'm not gone," she said gently. "I just stopped waiting for someone to let me stay." She returned to the cabin with her head high, cheeks kissed by wind, and hands full of small new beginnings. That evening, as John sat outside sharpening a blade, she knelt beside him. "I think I'd like to plant something this spring," she said. "Beans, maybe. Or corn." He didn't look up, just smiled. "Then we will." A week later, he carved something for her, a hairpin, whittled from cedar. It bore her initials. Not as they were on her papers back east, but as they were now, CRE. Agnes Red Elk. She didn't ask when it had changed. Or why. But when he handed her the pin, she took it in her hand, turned it over, and said softly, "I'd like to keep that name." He met her eyes then. Not with surprise, but with understanding. And beneath the twilight sky, as clouds painted themselves gold and violet, she reached out and touched his face. Not urgently. Not like someone reaching for salvation. But like someone remembering the way home. The next morning, they returned to town together. No announcement. No parade. They arrived with a wagon of herbs, baskets of pine soap, and a jar of wild honey. She sold them gently, steadily, with her shoulders straight and her eyes never cast down. John stood behind her, his presence quiet but unmoving. The townsfolk stared, unsure whether to nod or sneer. But the longer they watched, the more their silence unraveled into grudging respect. On the edge of town, beneath a sycamore tree where 2 stones marked the past, Pastor Cobb stood ready with a worn Bible in trembling hands. No audience. Just the preacher, the breeze, and 2 people who had survived winter. They exchanged vows with no rehearsal. Just the language they'd spoken all along, of glances and offerings, of silence shared beside firelight, of survival earned and love chosen, slowly. When the preacher asked for rings, Agnes slipped off the turquoise necklace and tied it around his wrist instead. He pressed a carved bead into her palm. Not a ring, but a promise. Smooth from days he'd carried it in his pocket. They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, neither rushing. The town behind them faded with each footfall. The road no longer felt long. It felt earned. That evening, she stood in the barn where she'd once curled in straw and cried herself to sleep. The beams still groaned. The hay still smelled of time. She walked to the beam where she had once etched her name. Agnes. She touched it once, then took the back of her knife and scratched the new name just beneath it. Agnes Red Elk. As the sun lowered behind the hills, painting the sky in fire, she sat in the doorway and listened to the wind. This time, it wasn't empty. It carried a story. Her story. And the final line wasn't about who didn't want her. It was about who saw her and stayed. If you've ever been turned away, made to feel like a burden, or treated like a season someone could weather and forget, remember Agnes. Her name had once been spoken in pity. Now, it was spoken in love. And not because someone gave it to her, but because she chose it herself. Sometimes the snow doesn't come to bury you. Sometimes, it comes to teach you how to rise.